Today, I am joined by Lafayette Lee. He is an anonymous poster, a father, ex military. There's not that much more information about him. He is a man of mystery, as some of my guests are. He is also the author of ruins.substack.com, a very good Substack, a very good Substack name that I'm already jealous of. Welcome, Lafayette Lee.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Thank you so much for coming on. I've been following your work, your tweets, your posts for a while. I'm a fan, and I think it's an interesting time to be someone in the U.S. who is, as far as I understand, you're not in the military anymore. You've served, and now you're in reserve, or I don't exactly know how these things work.
Yeah, no, I got out of the military several years ago. I was in for altogether within active and National Guard time. I was in for almost a decade, so got out fairly recently, and trying to navigate the world as a civilian now. It's been quite the adventure.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, given the things you speak about, and your awareness of what's going on in terms of the so-called globalist American empire, I wonder how you see your time in the military, kind of looking back with the eyes of today, with everything you've gone through and what you've learned. Like, how do you feel about essentially having served under a regime that might not necessarily be interested in the best for you or essentially the people you represent?
Yeah, no, this is something I talk about with a lot of my close friends who have a similar experience. And I don't think that because of the interests of this regime, it's not a conversation that I think gets a lot of attention purposefully. But there are a lot of veterans who came off of this global war on terror who have quite, have changed their perspective quite a bit, just given their own experience alone and what they've seen. That it creates kind of I don't know. There's a really strong tension, I guess you could say, between a very strong loyalty to what many of us see as our country, our homeland, right? The people that we believed that we were serving and protecting. I think most people who join the military, there's kind of there's a lot of people that will join the military for benefits and for, though that gets a lot of attention. With this recruitment crisis, that seems to be at the forefront of everybody's minds is how we can incentivize these people. But those of us who joined when there was fighting still, we joined. Most of the people I knew, we joined because we felt like we needed to protect something, maybe the near and dear, protect something at home, even though like 9/11 was something that happened in New York, it was felt throughout the nation. And that's a memory that many people in my same position, it felt very, very acutely. But over the course of serving, and I think I've said this many times before, as much as many of our contemporaries who never served have a particular disdain for the global American empire. Many of us who served in the military saw behind the curtain first. So this sense of disillusionment is something that many of us felt years ago, but we were still able to hold on to certain things to continue on. I think everyone who went downrange, I went on several deployments, and I know, there are other people out there who've been on, I know some people who've been on 10 deployments. The disillusionment sets in fairly early. So many of the people that have served, even in harm's way, and they knew that things were not necessarily what they had seemed when they joined, but they still did it anyway, and they still served with distinction, courage, and a lot of that came from a loyalty, kind of the fraternity that you have with those that you serve, and knowing that, and still being willing to fight under that flag. So, I mean, there's these things that are not as, they almost are intangible to a lot of people, but they're things that kept, at least for me, it kept me motivated, and it kept me in. But coming out, and I think with what we've seen recently, that there is it's beyond a crisis within the political bureaucracy. It's a crisis that is a national crisis, I would say, and it kind of calls into question a lot of the old assumptions that many of us had, even at the height of our disillusionment while we were in the military. Like, what is this country of ours? Does it still exist? Can we even call it a patria? you know, um, who are we serving? Most people, like I said, that I know felt like they were protecting or serving their friends and neighbors. I mean, I think there's a lot of folks that will denigrate military service today and assume that there's always some kind of either fantasy behind it, or there's just a self interest for benefits. But I will tell you from my own personal experiences, there was a definite sense of our homeland was attacked. We want to protect our people, our friends, our neighbors, our communities, and I feel like that was the most noble aspect of it. But I think even now, a lot of people like me, veterans or even those who are in, are starting to question whether even that if you can even say that anymore. Sorry for
Yeah.
the long-winded answer there, but
No, no, it makes sense, and it kind of highlights this divide that I kept seeing creep up in conversations about this, and the dissident right, or whatever circle is called now. It's the divide between essentially being a warrior and being a warrior in service of whatever empire, and that these two things were not necessarily the same thing. So there was kind of the going to protect the homeland, or we speak in these terms of tribes or communities, and this is just a completely natural, normal phase of almost like just being a male and wanting to do these things. The problem that people like that face now is that the only open gigs are, for people who essentially hate you, which is kind of the separate aspect of it. So there's this kind of roaring discussion at one point that, uh, is it even worth it being a warrior? Should you just kind of become like, I know, pirate outlaw and just move to the global south and I don't know, father 7,000 children, or, or something like that. I don't know, but it was an interesting discussion. I don't know enough about it personally to say, but yeah, it's there's clearly something to being a warrior, to going off to war, to protecting, to there are noble things to it, there are wild things to it. I don't know exactly what you know which how the split is in the appeal of these things.
Mhm. Yeah, no, there's definitely that's a big part of it, and I think that's something that should have more attention. Is that males today? It's there's there's definitely a need for, I think, men or boys who are becoming men to prove themselves, to go through certain rites of passage, and the military is by all means is very much like that, especially if you have an opportunity to go fight or you have an opportunity to put your life on the line. There's a lot of this. It drives me crazy. I don't even watch. I really don't watch like any war movies for the most part. I just can't hang with it. It's like a lot of them are probably closer to like Marvel movies to me, but there it's there's like kind of this anti-war. It's like this residue left over from the 1960s, from a very different war in a lot of ways, a very different time. But there's always like this, there's always this point trying to be made, is that war is always bad and war is always terrible, and war might always be terrible and it might always be destructive. I mean, we know this, but it's been with us from the beginning, and this is one of those things that I'm not a utopian. I don't believe that you can just it's just as pie in the sky as saving the planet, or world peace. Is war will always be with us, and I've heard it said it's the father of us all. And the best, I mean, for a young man, I mean, there is that warlike tendency. There's those things, that aspiration for greatness, to prove oneself, and these are societies and cultures for from the beginning until fairly recently. This was understood as things that needed to be cultivated rather than plucked out, not cured out of the individual, but something that needed to be cultivated. And when it was cultivated correctly, that you could have those more noble conflicts. You could trust the men at arms to protect you. I mean, I really do think the most noble. I mean, there are noble wars, and I'd say noble wars are those where you are defending your homeland, you're defending the people the way of life that you love and cherish. I mean, that is. I mean, at the essence, that's every story of every great civilization that we aspire to as Americans. I mean, I think that there's a definite direct line from our founding generation, how they viewed the Romans. But, it wasn't just that they viewed the Romans at their height, in the empire. That wasn't what they were aspiring to. They were aspiring to the yeoman Roman, republic that saved Rome from Carthage, and that's how they looked at that time period. It was that same kind of conflict. And that, to be a virtuous man, this is kind of our national inheritance, is to be a patriotic man, to be a good and virtuous man, was to balance that warlike tendency with your commitment to your hearth and home, and to protect those things, that they were fundamentally related, that if you could not protect your hearth and home, you couldn't really call yourself a man.
Yeah. What's your feeling about calling yourself a patriot now? Just given the nature of the patria, and it's it's I don't know. It's a hard thing. What do you relate to when you think about yourself as a patriot?
That's a great question. And this is the tension that I have a lot of the time, just generally, but also within the dissident right. I would call myself a patriot. I'm an American. My family has been here since 1635, and have been engaged in every major conflict that involved this country. Um, I do have a very different perspective on history than I would say most Americans do. I'm a student of history. I'm not, classically or professionally trained here. I'm just a country bumpkin who likes to read books. But um, I take a very different approach to certain historical events. But I can still call myself a patriot. And the reason why I can still do that, where I think would benefit a lot of Americans who are on the dissident right or flirting with that side of things, where they feel that disillusionment with maybe your conservatism Inc. and your American conservative movement. Um, they're America. The thing to understand about patriotism for me is that it is a connection to the near and dear. It is not an attachment to lofty ideals. It has to be embodied somewhere. And this is a national tension. So, by saying this, I'm recognizing that our nation has been at war between these two versions of patriotism from almost the beginning. And this is a sensibility that you'll find, at least where I'm coming from, is a lot more prominent in the South. But in understanding that your connection, you cannot transcend your own national history. You cannot transcend that. And there's an attempt on the left almost always, but there's starting to be one on the right, where a desire to kind of transcend that national history, to be able to free yourself from all of that baggage and to cling to some higher ideal. And I would say this is the folly of the left. This is how patriotism has been divorced from the country, where now you can have somebody supposedly fighting for their country, but they're really just fighting for gay rights in Ukraine, or they might be fighting for, they're fighting for equality abroad. They're not, there's no connection to the people back home. There's no connection to that, the customs and the mores and the way of life that you come from. And so I call myself a patriot because I connect those things fundamentally to something embodied, and that is to the people that I come from. It's to my neighborhood. It's to the land I love. It's to the national story that I'm a part of, that my ancestors were a part of. That is my kind of patriotism. But the lofty kind of Lincolnian, all men are created equal, ideals, that's not my kind of patriotism. I actually think that that's a fundamental error. And I know that that's probably not a direction you want to go, but, we've had these national transformations before. And that period of time in the United States, when it was, the war between the states, was really kind of a battle over those two versions of patriotism. And the one that won out, I think we are watching a lot of the baggage and the follies of that it's almost too hard to ignore. And so I guess if I had any kind of, and this is where I go with my Substack and on Twitter, is that I think that people should re-examine patriotism, but they need to re-examine patriotism by stepping slightly outside of the Lincoln lens. They need to view patriotism as their, maybe even their forefathers viewed it at the beginnings of this nation. And that's how I can still retain a level of patriotism, even as my government has become what it is.
Yeah, no, that's essentially a big theme on the show as well. That one of the kind of the linchpins and the folly of liberalism is this all men are created equal, taken to kind of a rationalistic extreme where it's actually the expectation is that all men are equal at the end. That's the result we're aiming for.
Hmm.
And even when bring conservative Con Inc. in here and they say, oh, it's just a equality of opportunity. That takes about 5 minutes to collapse into equality of outcome when people realize that there is no equality of outcome. Like you can't have a democratic system where group politics is extremely salient, minority politics is super salient, it swings elections without moving into the direction of equality of outcome. Like, duh. There's nothing really to say about that. So any system that promises this and promises to kind of plunder public coffers for the advantages, to buy the advantage of votes from X and Y community, how long do you think that can last? Any cool-headed observer will see that that's has about 5 minutes of lifespan on it. And I think it worked. I think in the U.S. and in the West for so long because there's a lot of ruin in such a rich nation. Just enough money to buffer the insanity, but I think now things are starting to have problems at the fundamental level, like the bridges, the wars, the things that the infrastructure, electricity, fuel, things like that are starting to fray in a very significant way. And that's it's just, yeah, the bill is coming for all of this excess.
No, absolutely. It's something I puzzle over all the time because, I two things that strike me as really interesting about this time period because that we're all living through, which, I don't want to sound like a doomer. I'm a perennial optimist, believe it or not. I do have a lot of we live in a very dangerous but exciting time. And I guess you can't really have, excitement without the danger and vice versa. But this is a very interesting time. And two things I've seen that I think we should take pause and kind of consider a little. It took a very long time, and granted, I'm not excusing the injustices of the past. I mean, there has been a lot of blood spilled on this continent over these fights in the past, long before we were born. But we it took this long for what I would say is for the whole thing to start to come breaking and crashing down. We've been in a state of decline for a little while here, but it's taken a really long time. And there's several explanations for that, but I've always believed that there's something special about Americans, and that's kind of goes back to this patriotism. Is like it's and conservatives tend to really lean hard on the Constitution, and as I have a great deal of respect for the Constitution and how it was developed and where it came from. But I do think there's a lot of misperceptions about what the Constitution was, what it is, and what its use is today. But I think a lot of folks, especially conservatives, will put a lot of stock into the Constitution alone, and they forget that the Constitution was very much an effort, it kind of an echo of like a Roman sensibility of creating a level of balance that would protect the social fabric and this dynamic, exceptional social fabric. And I've seen that despite all of the bad things that are happening, the bad things that this regime is doing to its own people, there's just so much looting and demoralization and acts of betrayal just over and over against this beleaguered population. But I'm just amazed that despite the most sophisticated propaganda machine, despite all the looting, despite the demoralization, despite the impoverishment of communities that were once, thriving, that there's still this large number of Americans that are holding on, that they're still pushing back, that they're still resisting, that they still reject the legitimacy of what's being done. And I think that that's something you can't overlook. It actually gives me a lot of hope because, I see history in cycles. I don't really view it as this linear progression. I don't know how you could at this point, but, you know, we are in a cycle here, and this is not unlike other crises that we have actually gone through in the past. And to see this group of Americans that will still push back, authentically push back. And you're not going to find this obviously in the halls of power. You're not going to find this within the cathedral, but you're going to find it out in the hinterlands where millions of people that work with their hands just do not accept this. They don't want to live this way. And that to me is very inspiring. That to me is what I believe, that is the heart of what it makes America truly great to me. That why I am proud to belong to this nation. It's a tradition that spans back all the way to the beginning, and I'm very pleased to see that it hasn't been stamped out entirely.
Yeah, and I feel like at least maybe it's also kind of my myopia because I'm in these circles, but I feel like an elite movement happening as well, where kind of the so-called client class exists, and they're I think growing in numbers just given the state of the world. But I think there are quite a lot of elites that are switching sides.
Hmm.
Hopefully, that's the promise. Because I mean, I'm coming from a completely different place. I mean, I'm one of these in a way, kind of aspirational, nobodies from Eastern Europe. Just went to school, and then yeah, I don't know if I'm like a Western elite or anything, if I made it, but it's just looking from the outside in. There are things that are attractive and interesting, and they're not happening on the left, like the old halls of power. If you really want to elbow your way into I don't know, whatever Ivy League schools and things like that, you probably have to mouth the platitudes. But I feel like they're just at the point where the level of sophistication that their platitudes have reached, and the level of baroqueness that all of these declarations have reached, is so stupid to people who actually have a little bit of a brain. That it just can't, like, the sexiness of this culture cannot continue. And it moves very fast as well because this isn't a culture or like a regime that's transmitted via newspapers or something. Like, all of this flows extremely fast through the internet, and these preference cascades can happen very, very fast and at a level that is really unprecedented. And elites, everyone can flip quite fast. And we've seen this in the fact that the slippery slope has gotten very slopey recently. Like, you know leftward winds have increased in speed, and exact I mean, who would have thought that they'd be mutilating children 10 years ago? But this is also kind of a byproduct of the internet. All the stuff like bloomed on Tumblr and things like that, and now it's in the mainstream. But it can also go the other way, like madness. Every effect has a backlash, and I feel like something's brewing. Like, this really can't go on. Obviously, this isn't like a prophecy or anything, but it just looks like that from someone who could have tried to really break my neck and get into the Ivy League. It just doesn't look good. Like, I don't want to rub like shoulders with these people. So I think maybe other people see it that way as well.
No, I think you're right. I do subscribe to kind of the elite theory of view things. Well, my people are are the everyday American types who I live in a community where most people work with their hands. I have a great deal of respect for people that work close to the land, people that work with their hands. There's a level of dignity that gets denied that I think is very important and actually is an anchor to our society in a lot of ways that keeps us from floating away when our elites are off chasing, the El Dorado. But I do subscribe more to that elite theory, and I believe you're exactly right, and I've seen it myself. As I've gone between these circles, between elite circles at some of the highest levels of governance, and also down in a place where most people live very just slightly above the poverty line, and like I said, work with their hands. I've traversing these two worlds has been very interesting to me, And I've just seen it on the elite side of things. I have absolutely seen this where there are a lot of people that are reevaluating where they want to go, that the career path that they thought that they had when they were younger, maybe when they took on all that debt or when they started their schooling, just it is not, it's either closed to them or it's not what they thought. It demands too much. And I've seen this too, and I find that that's what's so fascinating about the dissident right. It's probably what attracted me to Twitter and to all the different personalities that we all interact with there. There are a lot of very intelligent, highly educated people, and many of them are also in their own impressive career tracks. But for some reason, they are dissenting, and I think that I think if there is any hope, it will be uniting these two groups together. And I find that Twitter sometimes does that. I have a following. I have a following within the dissident right of folks that like to talk about theory and things like that. But I also have a big following with people that, like I said, work with their hands. That they're on Twitter just to speak their mind, get something off their chest. And I believe the merging of these two worlds, where the dissent is real, where the problems that they are observing are real. I think that that's really important. And I know that you had Curtis Yarvin on your podcast the other day, and I've enjoyed reading his work and listening to him. But I think he understands that connection is really important. And whoever can solve that problem on getting these two groups on the same page, and I don't believe that mass movements necessarily can lead themselves and govern themselves. You have to have an elite class. But in the past, we haven't seen that an elite class that has any loyalty to this group form. But we're starting to see a sense of loyalty, a sense of like ownership and responsibility that's, I think, emerging within some of these nascent elite circles. And I'm very excited to see where that goes in the future.
Yeah, I think once elites like Blake Masters or people in that vein are starting to signal their loyalty in much more explicit terms. Like he was talking about, um, you know, essentially, yeah, anti-white racism and things like that, which literally is not dinner table conversation any of the dinners that he might have been invited to, but apparently now it is because he's brought it up, and that's clearly a sign of, okay, I am taking you on as my client class,
Mhm.
I the like literally Roman tribune looking guy will take you on as my client class, and there's still quite a lot of people in that client class. I mean, in Arizona as well, but still, I'm sure his ambitions are even larger. So, yeah, and he's not the only one, and it's becoming much more allowable to signal to these classes, to this whole group, and not just this group. I think there are people of other races as well who are a bit tired of being pandered to in the most obscene way, and being bombarded with all sorts of. I don't know if the average black mom wants to trans their children or something like that, or
Mhm.
like Hispanic women are interested in stuff like that. It's just piling up too high, I think, on the Democrat side.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that this is something I've been observing. And I live in a community that I guess, and especially like these southern communities have a diversity that extends way back before even the country existed. So, and I think that there's kind of a stigma that, well, there's always been a stigma, that I think is more used to excuse the sins of, of folks who live in other parts of the country than really is as close to reality. But, a lot of these people, we have very diverse communities all over the country. And I completely agree. I think what we've seen is in the past that the Democrat coalition has been able to mobilize people on a basis of like racial identity, and that that worked for a period of time, but it's starting to come apart. And there's several reasons for that. I think one of those is you can't really tell me that a Brahmin Indian from who has been in this country for just a couple of years and works in the tech sector has the same kind of interests as somebody who grew up, who's the descendant of slaves in this country. You can't tell me that national past, that history, that they really have any kind of um, ownership over that. And yet, with the legal structure that we have, right, with the civil rights acts, is the way that they are, is that we're packing more and more groups um, into this legal framework that was really intended for one group of people for one specific reason. And I just don't think that that's sustainable. It doesn't work. And it's hard to promise, and you're seeing this already happening in elite institutions, is that a lot of the a lot of these benefits, I guess you could say, that come along with that legal apparatus are not being extended to Black Americans who are the descendants of slaves. They're being extended to what the left would call privileged uh, immigrants who are coming over to the country, and obviously they're not going to turn down opportunities, and that's makes sense. But that is becoming politically unsustainable. That single narrative to describe the oppressor oppressed. I just don't think it works, and it doesn't work when you have double digit inflation and when you have gas prices that hurt everyone. And I've long said that I think that this Democrat coalition is going to fall apart. The question for me is whether the opposition can seize the opportunity to take advantage of this and to put in, I guess, to do their very best to make sure that the damage that has been done by this coalition across the country, that there's some way to prevent this from happening again, to make sure that this is the end of that chapter. And I don't think that the Republican establishment has any inclination to do that, but I think people like Masters, Joe Kent, JD Vance, I think they see that, and I think they're willing to go there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more prominent arguments on our side is kind of the Christopher Caldwell. I think Richard Hanani has also kind of been talking about this, the idea that it's going to be very hard to push back on wokeness just because it is essentially wokeness derives from taking the civil rights at its word, and it all kind of flows out of that because you essentially kind of have the legal doctrine of disparate impact, and whenever
Mm.
you have disparate impact, that bloomed across gender discrimination, and yeah, now whenever you can bring a table and show, look at this Excel sheet that I have, look at these dimensions that I've isolated, there's disparate impact. You have legal leverage to impose your will, and to make that will politically salient because that's it. So essentially, whoever is the American Caesar, whoever the Caesar coalition is going to come, do you think they might need to take it out in the backyard and shoot it?
Well,
And yeah.
no, I think you're right. I mean, that's really a question. I think Caldwell and I've really enjoyed, reading some of his thoughts on this. I'm impressed to see people going there. I mean, this has been something that a lot of Americans can sense that there's something wrong with this, that it's fundamentally what I would say would be un-American by the way that we understand that. It's directly, it conflicts with, it really conflicts with a lot of the fundamental principles of how Americans treat law and how the tradition that we come from. And so to see Caldwell go there, I thought his book Age of Entitlement was fantastic. And then to see other scholars go there, I think is very important because I've said this for many times, is that woke. I agree with this assessment of the woke phenomenon. Is I don't really like when people compare it to a religion. Now I understand that there's religious impulses that animate it, but I don't like how it's portrayed as a religion because religion requires, most religions, I mean, I belong to a pretty high investment religion here, and it requires a level of commitment and a level of sacrifice. It requires something of the congregant, right? Um, that's the only way these kinds of religions succeed. This is why progressive religions, when they attempt to like take over, congregations, or when they try to come up with these new age religions, they collapse within several years. They just don't thrive. And it's because they actually are rejecting commitments. They're rejecting the commitment that you have to this thing. And so woke would not survive. This woke phenomenon would not survive without a very sophisticated apparatus underneath it that delivered benefits, that delivered advancements, prestige. These things are distributed through this apparatus that I talked about. And your ticket in, to become a card carrying member, you have to signal your woke bona fides. And so this is something that if you got rid of that system, if you were undermining it, their ability to deliver those spoils to their adherents, I don't think it would survive. It would probably experience the same kind of collapse that you see in these progressive attempts at creating their own religion. It just does not work. And that's why I think it is important to take a harder look at, the our new American founding, which started in 1964. Um, it's unsustainable. Underneath all that subcutaneous fat that we have on top of it, of all the silly HR games and all that nonsense, there is a bone, and the bone is the law. And in this country, we have a very strong legal tradition. I mean, I don't think that gets examined enough. The reason, aside from the dynamic, unique people that we have here, is we also have a very impressive legal tradition, and that legal tradition is responsible for kind of holding together so much of our society. And what happened in 1964, whether well intentioned or not, it kind of drove a hatchet right into the heart of that. And I think we're living in the death throes of that. So it's going to take a lot of political willpower. It's going to take a lot of people re-examining the past in a way that they never done before. But I think that with the right kind of leaders, and I think with the right kind of education, people will get there, and I hope that happens.
Yeah, it's an interesting history as well, because obviously, I didn't know much about, how civil rights was implemented, but if people can look up, the kind of the first images that essentially were used just in newspapers of busing, of people just being led into schools with I guess rifles, and the police was escorting, just moving populations from one school to another. It was, you could call it civil rights or civil coercion. It wasn't a very peaceful process, and there were a lot of black schools as well who weren't that happy with the forced integration. There was quite a lot of pushback from activists on the black school side. You know, they had in their own system worked out in many ways, and there are a lot of people resisting it. So it's an interesting complex history that I also don't have the whole picture of, but it is definitely more nuanced than the kind of the short version, where it's like it's just another level of freedom. We freed them, more freedom for everyone. There's a lot of coercion in some of that freedom.
Yeah, no, and it's and I think the unfortunate thing that I don't think a lot of people realize is if they actually go back and read primary sources from that time period, there was a lot of criticism of the way things were going from all ends of the spectrum, and even among Black Americans. There was a belief by the time Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was a belief that the civil rights movement had failed, and this wasn't coming from segregationists on the right. This was coming from the Black, what people call today the Black community. Is that there were a lot of Black Americans who felt very dissatisfied that what they had wanted had not been achieved, and that there were many costs associated that were put back on the backs of the same group of people that were supposedly being helped. And I think one of the biggest casualties of that time period that a lot of people don't realize is that that it kind of marked the death knell of the Black church as the locus of what the Black community is. And you see a reassertion or an assertion of politics driven by a lot of demagoguery, which and you don't even have to listen to me, as you can look at the decline of, you can look at a lot of the statistics that come out and see what has happened to families, what has happened to community. These are things, and my heart goes out to Americans of all stripes and walks of life from the damage done during the 1960s. It was, this was a legal revolution in many ways. It fundamentally changed a lot of long-standing institutions in this country that, while imperfect and while there were definite drawbacks and problems with it that we could talk about at length, there was something lost. And I think it was that organic material that is underneath the law. It's the invisible, intangible things that hold everything together. Many of those things were sacrificed and lost. And really, if you look at some the movers and shakers of that time, a lot of the lawmakers themselves, they put the burden on the most vulnerable populations. You talked to earlier about Boston, South Boston. I mean, a lot of the changes, the radical changes, were not taking place in you know the communities of the elites of their day. It was being taken out on the common man, both black and white. And I think that that is a real tragedy that has been understudied. And in American history, you'll see this every time that there's like some new founding. I like I said, I look at this in cycles. As you could go back to the American Revolution, you could see the Civil War as another war between the states as another example, and then you can also see maybe the New Deal regime and then the Civil Rights Movement. These are all periods that almost become apotheosized. It's like this where they attain a level of religious sacredness, and to question those, or to even to identify some of the dissidents of the time and to give them credence is almost, it's almost forbidden. And I think that that's going to change. I think that there's just too much weight and there's not enough support holding this thing up. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, I think I just want to make a recommendation for people if you're curious about the 1960s, and also especially about kind of dynamics around Black churches and how politics seeped into it. The Martyr Made God Socialist series, very very good. It's free. You can listen to it. It's wonderful, and it is about Jim Jones. Be
Mm,
surprised. I think he mentioned this on my podcast when he was on. It's like I think 80% of people who died at Jonestown were Black Americans.
mhm.
That's an interesting tidbit, and it's a nice little teaser for getting to you into the mindset of actually listening to, because it's a really long series, as he tends to do, very ample, researched and wonderful series, and just yeah, great, well narrated, wonderful. And it kind of goes through the history of Black liberation. Um, yeah, Martin Luther King's makes an appearance there. Malcolm X, like it's an amazing series, and obviously, yeah, the whole history of Jonestown, and why is he God socialist? Because he was essentially a political activist. Like the religious aspect of it was quite marginal, especially at the end. He was essentially bringing in the new utopia in a political sense rather than a religious sense. I think he actually declared himself an atheist, to the shock of many of his congregation, who were like, "Really?" But then again, they still hung around. Um, yeah, it's a crazy, absolutely crazy story, and yeah, people should look into it.
Yeah, no, that was a really great series, and I think that that's something that I love these projects, and this is kind of one of those things on the dissident right, or maybe close to it. This strange little corner that we find ourselves in is that there's a lot of reexamination of history, and even history that I think people have accepted as fact, is, but there's adding a lot more layers of information. This is like an onion you're peeling back, and I think a lot of people are starting to re-examine periods in time in which they just had very little interest, and it really speaks to the condition that we're in today. So I absolutely agree. I think that was a fantastic series.
Yeah, I think, once you realize that, a few little puzzle pieces were absolute complete outright lies, then you start, becoming a bit of a revisionist and listening to also, I mean, I'm sure that there is, a huge percentage of, revisionism that's just, again, kind of completely, throwing things against the wall, seeing what sticks. And I'm sure there are cranks who wrote books, in the olden times, and they had all sorts of weird ideas, and we shouldn't take everyone seriously. But there is quite a lot of interesting stuff that was prescient and also predictive. And Thomas 777 obviously is the kind of the high priest of revisionism. He's also got all sorts of works, but yeah, a lot of the stuff is being done. And I don't want to say that Daryl or Martyr Made is very revisionist, but it's very in depth, so you're going to get all sorts of angles on it. And yeah, there's huge movement. I mean, I think a lot of people are inspired by Curtis Yarvin as well, because once you kind of blow the lid off power, and the narratives that supposedly power works this way, but actually it doesn't work that way at all, then that's really interesting to apply that lens to history. and then yeah, shock yourself every time seeing, oh, actually, this is what happened.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think there's a lot of, there's what I like that Curtis Yarvin does, and I don't, I agree with him on a lot, but there's several things with history that, and this might just be like the old patriot in me. Is I have a hard time when somebody defends the Tories, but it's I enjoy listening to him. And what I think he does that is a good example is he reads primary sources. I think that that's really important in a moment like this is to read primary sources and to understand. And if you don't understand the primary sources, to find ways to, augment that with other primary sources from the time so that you start to understand the language and the of the people. We talked about earlier about the founding of the country. I take a very different approach on how the founding came about. And I feel like my position is supported, but it's supported by primary documents. It's supported by primary sources. And there kind of comes this point of telephone that we all kind of rely on the understanding of the generation before us or from the historians of our time. And like you said before, part of that is not just to try to really ascertain the truth ascertain the truth from a historical event. A lot of times it's there are attempts to justify your interests in the current time. You know, like you'll see this all the time. It's the incoherence of the left, which I love it. I find it. I think it's enjoyable to watch. It's hilarious, but it's 1 minute. We need to measure up to the promise of the founding, which is equality for everybody. Which, as you already identified, really just means equality of outcome for everyone. But also, the founding generation didn't really know anything, and so why should we be held to these founding documents that are so old, or these were authored by slave owners, and so there's also like a moral taint to this, and so and it's just this incoherence and I think that it causes a lot of people to obviously it makes no sense and it's difficult to hang with, but it makes a lot of people check out because it seems like it seems too convoluted and difficult to understand. And a lot of regular people will chalk that up to they just don't have the training. But I would argue, it's not about the training. It's because it's hard to entertain an incoherent argument. So I think consulting
Yeah.
primary sources is excellent to do.
Exactly. I mean, we're essentially speaking from a position of being out of power. I mean, it's coherent to the left. That's the only thing they care about. It's coherent in the sense that, you know, they know who is friend, they know who is enemy. They don't have to be. It's kind of like the whole free speech absolutism. Whenever you hear someone arguing for free speech absolutism, it's someone who's not in power, someone who's vying for, for power and is being excluded by the mainstream. He is enemy. And that's why, free speech is so important. The left was arguing for free speech when they weren't in power, or at least the left that we have now wasn't in power. And yeah, they were also kind of on the back foot. The second you get power, you close the drawbridge. There are no principles in the ivory tower. It's just friend enemy, which is clear once you realize that they really don't. I mean, you see this. There's a whole industry of kind of anti woke centrism, IDW, Ben Shapiro people. Essentially, this is all they do. They point out left hypocrisy.
Hmm. Yeah.
They don't care. You don't get measured by their standards. Like, it makes sense from their perspective. So, I understand it's interesting and there's a demographic that wants to see that. But it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. That's what it is.
No, that's a great point. I think that what I would, and this kind of goes to like when I get people that will DM me and ask, what is to be done, and understanding and seeing the macro level problems, it can be dizzying. It can be really difficult for a regular person to know what to do, and there's a demoralization that comes along with that. I try to avoid that. I sometimes indulge in it, and I really kick myself when I do. But I would, kind of what you were saying begs this point is that regular people have the ability to do something. And this is important to understand is that, and it might feel like it is sitting down in a room with Ben Shapiro and debating or, pointing out the left's hypocrisy. There might be some use to that, but it's not at all as effective as a living an ordered and healthy life. I mean, when we talk about hierarchy and when we talk about when, what the left was attacking the whole time wasn't just the right's ideas, it wasn't the establishment's ideas, right? It was they were attacking these invisible structures of order that have existed here for a very long time, institutions that were being held together by tradition, by custom, by history, by biology. I mean, the way that we have families and things like that. The left was always attacking that, and the right misinterpreted that as they're just attacking the ideas. So let's just talk about ideas. And it's not about ideas. What the biggest threat to the left is you living a healthy, productive, God, in my opinion, God fearing life, and creating those and nurturing and cultivating those structures in your respective spheres of where you are. You know, I live in a small town. I don't suspect any of my neighbors or me are going to walk into Washington and change it.
Don't.
We're not going to save the planet. We're not going to get out our pitchforks and we're not going to walk in and, you know, force a regime change. But what we can do is that we have institutions that still are hanging on in our communities. We have neighbors, I have children, we have schooling, we have churches. There are so many of these the vestiges of the old order that still exist. They might be weak, they might be fragile, but then our goal, our objective should be, you know, after arguing on Twitter for a while, go out there and strengthen those institutions. If you can't, if it's too formidable for you in the place that you live, I guarantee you can do it in the walls within the walls of your own home. And I know that that's not going, you know, this is how these things come about. It's not just one seismic shift with one individual alone. There has to be a level of, you know, people call it infrastructure, but there has to be a fertile soil that exists underneath this. This is how these things happen. And if you aren't cultivating the soil where you're at, you know, it's not enough. It will never be enough. And so I think that that's maybe those of us on the right. And I love arguing on Twitter. I do it way too much. But the most important thing that I do is, you know, is raising my children, loving my wife, saying my prayers at the end of the day, being a good neighbor, and getting involved in strengthening these little touch points that exist all around me in my respective sphere. That to me is more far more important than arguing with Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with this. And yeah, it's, when the macro game is laid out the way it is, and you saw what happens, when you take up the pitchforks, it's just not strategically not a very good idea for people on our side to be engaging in that in any way. Yeah, it's you kind of have to build it from the micro level, especially at the level that is invisible to the regime. Like, if you are a good neighbor, if you live a good, decent life, if you educate your children in the spirit of your beliefs, that's not necessarily on the radar. A lot of the stuff that's visible and even like irritating to the regime is like you said, just arguing on Twitter. I mean, I see the irony in this podcast, but still, it's a good rally point. I'm not saying that having this content out, writing and producing content is a bad thing to do, but it's definitely not like the thing that's going to change. It does help rally people. It does help kind of, it's like a flare in the night, and like, okay, where are my people? And it helps. But like you said, just loving your children, doing things with your hands. I know this is like crazy, hippie stuff, but you know, just going out there, learning a skill. And I'm not saying everyone should be working in the trades, but it's good to learn how to survive. Like, my husband's like a, I don't know, like a survival and bushcraft specialist. That wasn't on the list of things that I was looking for, but it might come in handy. So I think it's really cool. And yeah, he's a great fisherman and all this type of stuff. Like, these things are good, and they're good because they put you in contact with um you know just the reality of being a human creature on the planet Earth. And these things are just indispensable, like being a mother. Just like I really don't feel like I was complete as a being before I had my child. And I'm not just saying this from like a weird ideological thing. Like I really didn't know what was up until I could have that connection with another being. And they're just things that people have been doing for thousands of years, millennia, even more. Hundreds of thousands of years, and they're still essential now. And I feel like um, and they're essential in ways that are not reducible to argument. They're not.
Mm.
You can't necessarily write an essay about how great it is to be able to light a fire in the forest. Maybe you can, but you know what I mean. It's just a sensory embodied thing about doing things in reality that's just not. It's hard to convey on Twitter or something like that. So yeah, I feel like a lot of these ingredients will go into just preparing yourself for whatever comes. There's no better way of managing whatever comes. It's just being a solid human being for yourself and the people around you, reliable and good.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being on Twitter and sharing. What I love about your podcast, what I love about our sphere on Twitter is it gives me inspiration. It also helps me find different ways to analyze the problems that I'm seeing around me. It helps me understand also, like you brought up, is that we're not just standing alone here, and that there are ideas and there are ways to examine problems that haven't been really given the oxygen they deserve that could very well improve our condition. But going to what you said is, and there's really no greater calling than being a parent, especially being a mother. And I think that there's the aspect of it that I think is really important to remember is that we don't organize societies around ideas. We don't. And I love ideas. I love them, and I think they're great to share and they're great to debate about. But at the end of the day, that we don't organize ourselves around these things. It's the things that we don't think about that we naturally do day in and day out. Somebody paid a price for that. I don't know when, but one of your ancestors at some point paid a price. Many of your ancestors paid a price to fine tune these things to get to the point where you didn't have to think about them. And I think it's something to remember is that these traditions, customs, mores that we all have and that we've inherited, when we lose them, it deranges us. And so I think that that's where the balance is important in understanding that, it might just be building a fire out in the woods. But one day you might be cold and wet and hungry, and building that fire in the woods will feel like a life-changing experience. And I've been there. And it's why those things, when they come in handy, when they come through, it can almost be a transcendental experience when these things serve their purpose in the best way they can. And that's why being a parent, that's why you're almost like it's almost like it's like you're cultivating the soil. And that act in and of itself, although it can put food on your table, it also nurtures your soul and makes you a more virtuous person. I think that that's what was always baked in the cake with Americans. There was something coming from this agrarian culture that we all came from originally here that gave a level of virtue that was very, very enriching to our bodies and our minds and our souls. And I think that if we can get that connection back, if we can connect the ideas that we have, the impressions that we have to those invisible structures that we need to cultivate and protect, I think that we'll be able to get out of this. We're not going to get out of it in like great shape. I think we're going to be pretty beat up. It's a knockout, drag down fight. But at the end of the day, I think that we will succeed because I think that there's a lot more to us and to the world that we've inherited than we realize. I think our goal should be to rediscover those things. And I think integrating those into our lives, I think will give us the strength we need to move forward.
Yeah, and your point about our ancestors, I kind of keep reminding myself that even if I encounter hardship in my life, it really probably pales in comparison to all of the hardship that my ancestors had to go through, just so I could exist here and just to pass along the traditions of my family. And I mean, for my family, it's a bit more complicated because we're just like literally from everywhere, and there's so many traditions that with communism as well. I might need to read some books to figure out what our traditions are. But yeah, that's just Eastern Europe for you. But it's one of those. A lot of these traditions are tied into kind of these transformational experiences as well. Like, I talked about motherhood. That's, an obvious transformational experience, and it's one of those experiences where you really don't know who you'll be after it happens. You can't
Mhm.
really model, what it's going to be like, who you're going to be. But there's a lot of things that are traditional that are kind of these kind of gateway rituals, initiations and things like that are actually transformational, that we've really kind of gotten rid of at this point. So it's not we don't really have, male initiation. We don't really have, female initiations, or those steps where, like, even in the life of a woman, you'd have kind of a maiden phase, you'd have a motherhood phase, and then you have a kind of a crone old lady, matriarch phase, depending on which region you're from. And all of that is kind of out the window, and then we're just kind of these producer consumers tied to the market. And are you able to produce? Are you able to consume? Oh no, that person there is able to produce less and consume less than you. Oh, that's inequality. We need to make them consume more. And it's just all this is the only benchmark, the only like spreadsheet that we're all measured up against. And it's an important one. I don't want anyone to starve. Consuming foods and shelter is great, but there's like the marginal return on an additional unit of producing, consuming starts to fade after a while. Like, there is more to life than that, and I feel like that's the biggest thing we've lost. And a lot of people just really, they don't know what it would feel like not to be like this. They didn't go through those transformational experiences. They're like 45 in their, cubicle apartment working a weird job, and they're feeling like shit, and they really don't know why. Why am I in this phase? Why am I in this situation? How would I have felt if I was in a different situation? It's just, I don't know. It's not to black pill, but I feel like it's hard to communicate why this stuff is important to people, because it's not going to be in like a New Yorker article.
Mhm.
That's not where it comes from.
No, yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, motherhood's a great example of that. Is you had no idea what it was until it happened, right? And
Yeah.
now, I imagine, not to speak for you, I imagine you feel like a completely different person after
Yeah.
having your child. I mean, I feel the same way. I can't even. I tell this to my family, young people in my family who ask me about marriage, because I've been married for a hot minute and have my kids, and I just say, I don't even know what it was like. I can't even remember what it was like to not have my family, and I don't, and the point is that I wasn't really a complete person, and I could feel that, I can feel that now. And this transformational experience is natural. It's good. And I think that the more that we can, and this is where the politics come in. I think this is the proper role of politics, is there are these pre-political issues and institutions that are under assault that need to be protected because they are natural, because they are good, and because human beings without them are not going to be able to live lives of meaning and purpose, and ever find, in my opinion, like happiness, the like what real happy or joy. I don't really like the word happiness, but maybe like the joy that comes along with being a parent, which is full of suffering. It's full of joy, though. And that's what these institutions that we have to fight to protect, that's what they offer. And, a world that without these things just will not be able to deliver it won't be able to deliver any kind of like real benefit to people's lives. They can be completely satiated. They can be, they can have every material need taken care of. But if they are missing that piece, it's just gone. It's not enough. I feel like our culture has been pushing facts and figures and statistics around the circumference of like a collapsed truth for so long, and it causes us so much pain. It's hard to watch because there's just this level of just incoherent rage and anger and despair that you see, and that really gets reflected through politics. And so much of it comes down to what you brought up, is that these things have eroded, or they've been stolen, and people feel that pain, but they don't know where to place it. And that's where I think, and this is not a grand solution. I tend to believe that this is going to take a very long time. I think, the the plucky American in me wants to believe that we can just get this fixed in a generation or two and back on track. But if you think about it, many of the things that are falling, that are being torn asunder, are things that took thousands of years to develop. We're fundamentally realtering things that took that long to for us to inherit. And so I don't think that there's going to be a quick solution, but that is not to say that the things that we can do now every day, the things that we can do to build, like my relationship with my children, my relationship with my neighbors, and really, like, that's where the traditions, if you don't have those traditions, actively going about and trying to reform those connections with people, getting your hands dirty, doing things that bring you a level of satisfaction. It could be in the gym. I mean, there's so many things, but it's really just getting out, and that's where, this is the fertile soil where new traditions will arise. And I think that that's something that we need to keep in perspective. We might not, this might take generations. I don't know how long it will take for us to get where we can feel like our society is not taking from us, but is actually enriching, like culture can thrive. But I know that we can do our part every day, and that will bring a level of comfort and satisfaction to our lives.
Yeah, and I feel like, I keep bringing up a point that a previous guest made, a guy from South Africa, Conscious Caracal, shout out,
He's great.
that he's awesome. And he was saying that, he loves living in heroic times. South Africa is, about a hot minute later than in other places, and it is a genuinely dangerous situation where he lives as well. And he's had encounters, all sorts of violence and things like that. But he feels that it's meaning giving. He knows exactly who he is. He knows who he's fighting for. He knows who his family is. He's active politically. He's active in all sorts of ways. Like he wakes up every morning with you know a huge amount of spirit to power him through whatever he's planning that day. It's just like he doesn't. I don't think he has any like existential crises on the horizon. Like man knows what he's doing, and I think there's something to that. It's good to live in heroic times in many ways.
No, it is. I think, the happiest that I've ever been in my life is times when I had the least. And, I was slogging it out, trying to support a family, growing family on a shoestring budget, and having to be gone, and going far off backwaters in the world, and fighting under a flag, and with my dear friends. I mean, these are things that I look back, and that was the happiest I've ever been. Was living in a time when something was demanded of me, and I had commitments, and my commitments I needed to honor. And that's really what it is. I think you could be anywhere in the world, and as long as you have those commitments, and you honor those commitments, and you face them and stand up straight and do so, you can find a lot of meaning there. And that's every person can do that, and that's something I try to emphasize all the time on my account, is that there are people like Blake Masters out there, and I am very grateful for that. But there are also people like me. There are also people like my neighbor down the street, and we don't want to be dead in the water here. We have things that we can do. We have commitments to honor just as well. And I think that that's how we're gonna move forward, not backwards.
Yeah, and just simply recommitting to the people in your life, which is essentially what, in many ways, the 1960s robbed the boomers of, and a lot of the millennial generation, is this idea that you're not really committed to people. You're not committed to your family. If you're toxic, leave them. If your wife is whatever too old, leave her. If your husband's you could get a better model, leave him. Just recommitting to the people, the institutions, the locations, the thing in your it's quite simple. It's just a decision that you have to make and stick with it. It's simple but not easy. These things tend to be all of these important transformational commitments aren't easy, but they happen. You can do it right now. Commit, my friends. Yeah. Anyway, on that inspirational note, I want to ask you the question of the show. The last question is always: do you have a subversive thinker, living or dead, writer, whoever you think is interesting that people may not have heard of, maybe they've heard of, but they don't know that this person is as interesting as you think they are?
No, absolutely. I want to give this one. This is, I have several that I really enjoy, but there's one thinker that I really appreciate, and I think would be very good for my friends and colleagues on the dissident right side of things, who are maybe re-examining patriotism, or maybe they've given up on patriotism. And just because that was kind of the subject of our part of our conversation today, I think I would like to introduce them to Mel Bradford, or he went by M.E. Bradford as well. Um, he was a Southern traditionalist who, his demise, I guess you could say, when he was very much, it's nice because it adds like a little layer of history, is the neoconservatives kind of purged him from, they kind of squashed any of the higher ambitions that he had. And you really see this tension between that traditionalist, maybe older right that existed in this country, and this neoconservative, quote unquote right, that really altered the makeup of the conservative movement in this country. And so Mel Bradford is his name, and there's a book he wrote that I think would be really beneficial to everybody to take a look at. It's called A Better Guide Than Reason, and he focuses a lot on where he goes against the grain in saying that the Declaration of Independence was like asserting certain propositional truths. He shies away from that Platonic reading of the Declaration of Independence and goes more into a you know uh, he goes into a more rooted and embodied perspective, that it didn't just emerge from good ideas or nothing. It emerged from soil, from a people, from a time locked in by history. I think this is really important for Americans to read today. I recognize that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence might seem slightly toothless or irrelevant today, but I think for my friends on the dissident right to take a look at the parallels between what he is talking about in this book and about the time that we are living in, when there are certain questions that are finally being asked, when we might be able to go in a new direction as a nation. You might find that there's a lot of parallels between the founding generation and between our generation today that you might be able to find some inspiration there. So I'd like to introduce the audience who hasn't heard of Mel Bradford and A Better Guide Than Reason to take a look. I think they'll find a lot there.
Yeah, that's an excellent recommendation. Not been recommended before. I didn't know about him. And I think it pairs well, I think, with reading Albion Seed, which is quite an interesting um I don't know, red pill, I guess. I don't know what color of pill it was for me, but just understanding kind of what the mores, the culture of the founding stock of the United States was. It's quite interesting. And it's, like, if you would have put a village of Romanian peasants, it would have been a completely different society in so many ways. It's just, it's just very, very different type of lifestyle. And I feel like it's clear from the book, and this is a book by David Hackett Fisher, that it's a lot of the things that are very specific to American culture, originated in these first enclaves, and it just couldn't have been any other way. And it is very like specific to kind of this Anglo ethnos and yeah, their traditions and customs. So yeah, I think that's a really it's an interesting I don't know, parallel. At least I think it is. I don't know. I haven't read Mel Bradford, but I'll add him to our reading list.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I think it's really beneficial. I think folks would find that we are not the same people. I think that's the first thing. We're not the same people that existed then. We might have some of that ancestry, but we aren't the same people. But I think the question to ask is then, who are we? Are we a people? I believe we still are. And I think that what matters most is to understand what makes us a people today. And I think that that will give us a kind of anchoring that we need. So,
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Lee. This was lovely, as I was sure it's going to be, and it was. Is there, outside of the Substack, which is ruins.substack.com, there any other place that people can find you that people should go to?
I kind of maintain a fairly low profile. Yeah, you can check me out on Ruins. I call it the Ruins of Kurodaman, but it goes by ruins.substack.com. I'm working on a couple projects too that I'll probably be releasing there. I'm doing an analysis of Apocalypse Now, and I've
Nice.
got another one coming out in this week. And so stay tuned for that.
Excellent, excellent. And on Twitter at partisan underline O? Is it
Yep,
0?
that's right. Yep,
Yeah,
partisan
okay.
underscore O. Yep.
Oh, yeah. Okay, perfect, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Lee. This was lovely.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on, Alex. It was a pleasure.